Most people believe they're exhausted because life is heavy, when often they're tired from carrying a version of themselves that isn't true anymore. There's a quiet kind of loneliness that can exist even in a full room, a sense of being slightly misplaced in your own story. If you've ever wondered when you started feeling like a stranger to your own days, you're not alone, and you're not broken. Sometimes the way back doesn't require changing everything, only remembering something you never meant to forget. This story is about that gentle return, the kind that happens softly, almost without announcement. It begins with a man who had done everything right and still felt off balance, as if life had shifted a few inches without telling him. He wasn't searching for success or answers, just for the quiet feeling of being real again. What he discovered wasn't a grand revelation, but a simple truth most people overlook while trying to keep up. Strangely, it was easier than he expected, and also braver. Because coming back to yourself asks only one thing: honesty, offered in small, steady moments. If your heart has been asking for rest, clarity, or just a place to land, stay a little while. You may find that peace isn't somewhere far away, but waiting patiently beneath the noise. And perhaps, as this story unfolds, something in you will recognize the path before it's even named. Not a new path, the one that leads quietly home, the kind you can begin walking in the next breath. He had begun to feel like a polite guest in his own life, careful not to disturb anything. Mornings arrived the same way. Alarm, coffee, a nod to the mirror, as if greeting a stranger. Somewhere along the years, his laughter had grown quieter, almost apologetic. He couldn't say when the distance started, only that it now sat beside him like an old suitcase. It was always there, closed tight, as if holding pieces of someone he used to know. On certain afternoons, he would pause mid-step, unsure why he'd entered a room. Not forgetfulness exactly, more like his thoughts had wandered off without him. He kept moving, answering messages, meeting expectations, tying loose ends that never stayed tied. Yet a faint ache followed him, the kind that doesn't shout, only lingers. If he listened closely, it sounded like a question he'd been postponing for years. Sometimes he'd sit in his parked car a minute longer than necessary, hands resting on the wheel. The world outside kept rushing, but inside there was only a heavy, patient silence. He would imagine opening that old suitcase on the seat beside him, just to peek inside. But the latch looked stubborn, as though it required a password he no longer remembered. So he'd sigh, step out, and return to the rhythm that asked nothing personal of him. People said he was reliable, strong, the one who always showed up. He smiled at that, though it felt like being praised for wearing a coat that didn't fit. At night, exhaustion came not from effort, but from the quiet pretending. He'd lie awake wondering when he'd last chosen something simply because it felt true. The ceiling offered no answers, only a blankness that mirrored his own. One evening, passing a shop window, he caught his reflection and slowed. For a moment he studied the face as though it belonged to a character in a story. There was kindness there and weariness, and something else, a faint homesickness. He wondered, not for the first time, if a person could return to themselves after drifting so far. And strangely, the old suitcase in his mind seemed to shift, as if something inside had stirred. A few days later, he found himself sitting on a quiet park bench he didn't remember choosing. The city hummed at a distance, like a radio left on in another room. For once, no one expected anything from him, and the stillness felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. The old suitcase rested in his thoughts again, not heavy this time, just present. He noticed that when he stopped rushing, something inside him leaned forward as if hoping to be heard. He tried a small experiment, though he would have laughed if someone had called it that. Closing his eyes, he took one slow breath, then another, letting the air settle where tension lived. At first there was only noise, unfinished conversations, remembered criticisms, tomorrow's duties. But beneath that, softer than a whisper, was a feeling that didn't demand, only waited. It felt oddly familiar, like recognizing a song you hadn't heard since childhood. He realized then that maybe nothing inside him had vanished at all. Perhaps it had simply been buried under years of careful compliance and constant motion. The thought didn't arrive with fireworks, just a quiet, steady warmth in his chest, as if someone patient had been sitting in the dark all along, trusting he'd return. He almost apologized out loud, then smiled at himself for the impulse. A breeze moved through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the path. He watched them drift without urgency, each one following its own gentle logic. It occurred to him that he'd been living like a leaf trapped in a current, not one carried by it. What if peace wasn't something to chase, but something that surfaced when he stopped running? The suitcase in his mind felt lighter, as though its contents had shifted into place. When he opened his eyes, the world looked the same, yet not entirely. Colors seemed less rushed, sounds less sharp, as if everything had agreed to speak softly. He placed a hand over his chest, a little embarrassed, a little relieved. If returning to himself began with simply listening, maybe the way back wasn't lost after all. And just then, he noticed someone watching him from the other end of the bench. The man at the other end of the bench had kind eyes, the sort that didn't pry. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a shared secret neither of them needed to explain. Our protagonist felt an odd urge to justify his presence there, though no words came out. He simply returned the nod, clutching the quiet moment like something fragile. The old suitcase lingered in his thoughts, suddenly heavier under this gentle attention. He had built his life carefully, brick by brick, following plans that made others proud. A dependable career, polite conversations, a calendar filled so tightly it left no gaps. People often said he was doing well, and he'd learned to echo that sentiment on cue. Still, fulfillment never quite settled in. It hovered just out of reach, like a misplaced key. Sometimes he wondered if he had mistaken motion for meaning all along. At family gatherings, he played the role of the steady one, the listener, the problem solver. No one noticed how rarely he spoke about himself, or how quickly he deflected questions. It wasn't that he wanted to disappear, only that he no longer knew what to reveal. The version of him they knew felt rehearsed, like lines memorized years ago. Meanwhile, the real words remained folded inside that invisible suitcase. Late at night, when the world finally loosened its grip, longing would slip through. Not for adventure or applause, just for the quiet feeling of being genuine again. He missed the ease he once carried, the way decisions had come from somewhere clear. Now, everything passed through a filter of expectations, careful and exhausting. Even small choices, what to eat, where to go, felt oddly disconnected from desire. As he sat beside the stranger on the bench, he sensed that this person saw more than appearances, not in a piercing way, just a calm recognition, like noticing rain before it falls. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel pressured to perform or explain. The silence between them felt spacious, almost kind, and he exhaled without meaning to. Somehow he knew this quiet encounter was about to open something he'd kept closed for years. After a while, the stranger gestured toward the space between them with a gentle tilt of his head. "Long day?" he asked, not as small talk, but as if the question had weight. Our protagonist hesitated, then surprised himself by answering honestly, "Long years." The words slipped out before he could tidy them, and he almost apologized. Instead, he glanced down, imagining the old suitcase now resting at his feet. In his mind, it looked worn, corners scuffed, handle slightly crooked from overuse. It had followed him through every decision, every compromise, every quiet surrender. He pictured labels stuck to its surface: reliable, agreeable, strong, none written by him. The stranger seemed to notice the shift in his expression, as though he could see it too. "Carrying something heavy?" he asked softly, eyes warm with understanding. He let out a small breath that trembled on the way out. "Yes," he said, though he wasn't speaking about anything visible. "It feels like it holds pieces of me I don't know how to put back." The admission settled between them, fragile but oddly relieving. For once, he didn't rush to change the subject or make a joke. The stranger nodded, not with sympathy but with recognition. "Sometimes we pack ourselves away to make room for what others need," he said. His voice carried the calm of someone who had unpacked his own burdens long ago. Our protagonist imagined opening the suitcase, unsure what he might find inside. Part of him feared emptiness, another part feared too much truth. A breeze lifted, rustling the trees, and he wrapped his arms loosely around himself. The suitcase in his mind no longer felt like an object, more like a distance he'd traveled. He wondered what it would be like to set it down, even for a moment. Not abandon it, just loosen his grip and rest his hands. As if sensing the thought, the stranger shifted slightly closer, ready to speak again. The stranger introduced himself simply, as though names were just practical details. There was no performance in him, no subtle effort to impress or be understood. He sat with an ease that made the bench feel less like a waiting place and more like a refuge. Our protagonist noticed how the man's shoulders rested, unguarded, as if he trusted the air. It stirred a quiet curiosity. What would it feel like to exist without bracing all the time? You don't have to explain anything, the man said, watching a bird land nearby. The words landed gently, dissolving the pressure our protagonist hadn't known he carried. Most people leaned in with advice or questions, eager to fix what they didn't grasp. This one simply made space, as though silence itself were a kind of medicine. For the first time, the suitcase in his mind didn't feel exposed, just acknowledged. They sat for a while without speaking, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be filled. Our protagonist found himself matching the man's slow breathing without trying. Inhale, pause, exhale, a rhythm that softened the tight places in his chest. It felt almost embarrassing how much relief came from something so simple. He wondered how many years he'd spent holding his breath without noticing. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded less rehearsed, more like it belonged to him. "I don't know how to stop being who everyone expects," he admitted. The man turned to him with a small, understanding smile, free of pity. "Maybe you don't stop," he said gently. "Maybe you just begin being honest." The idea lingered in the air, unsettling and comforting at once. He imagined setting the suitcase down between his feet, not hiding it, not clutching it. The gesture existed only in his mind, yet his shoulders eased as if it were real. The man noticed, giving a slight nod that felt like quiet encouragement. "Honesty isn't loud," he added. "It usually sounds like a whisper you finally listen to." And something in our protagonist leaned toward that whisper, unsure but willing. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The man reached down and traced a slow circle on the ground with the tip of his shoe. "Most people think they're lost," he said, watching the faint mark in the dust. "But often they're just wearing roles that stopped fitting a long time ago." Our protagonist felt the words settle somewhere deep, like a key brushing a lock. He glanced at the imagined suitcase, suddenly aware of how tightly he still held it. "What happens if you put it down?" the man asked, nodding toward nothing visible. The question startled him, as though the stranger had stepped into his private thoughts. He pictured loosening his grip, fingers stiff from carrying something too long. For a moment, fear rushed in. Who would he be without the weight? Then, just beneath the fear, a quiet curiosity flickered awake. He imagined opening the suitcase at last, hands trembling slightly. Inside were not trophies or failures, but old versions of himself folded carefully. A sketchbook he'd abandoned, a laugh he'd silenced, choices he'd postponed. Nothing demanded to be picked up again. They simply waited to be acknowledged. The realization felt strangely kind, as if nothing inside blamed him for leaving. The man spoke again, voice calm as a steady shoreline. "Returning to yourself isn't about becoming someone new," he said. "It's about releasing what you were never meant to carry forever." Our protagonist exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to come from years back. In his mind, he closed the suitcase, not locked this time, just gently shut. He set it beside him on the bench, hands resting free on his knees. The space it left behind felt unfamiliar, almost too light. Yet there was relief too, like removing a coat after realizing winter had passed. He glanced at the man, unsure whether to thank him or question him, but the man was already watching the horizon, as if inviting him to look there too. In the days that followed, he noticed small pauses appearing where there had only been haste. Before answering a message, he would take one quiet breath as if checking in with himself first. Sometimes the honest reply was shorter than expected. Sometimes it was simply delayed. The world didn't collapse the way he'd secretly feared it might. Meanwhile, the suitcase stayed in his thoughts, but now it rested beside him, not in his hands. At work, when a sharp remark came his way, he felt the old reflex rise. Smile, agree, move on. Instead, he let the moment linger, pressing his thumb gently into his palm. It grounded him, a tiny signal that he didn't have to abandon himself to keep the peace. His response came slower, softer, but it carried a firmness he hadn't practiced before. To his surprise, the conversation settled rather than escalating. Of course, fear visited too, usually in the quiet hours before sleep. He worried about disappointing people, about seeming distant or difficult. Yet each time he imagined reaching for the suitcase again, something in him resisted. He would place a hand on his chest, breathe once, and let the feeling pass through. Relief often followed, shy but unmistakable, like sunlight slipping under a curtain. One afternoon, he realized he'd spent an entire day without rehearsing conversations in his head. The absence felt so strange he almost laughed, a low sound that startled him. He caught his reflection in a window and saw a face that looked less guarded, not transformed, not radiant, just quietly present. The suitcase, in his mind, had stopped rattling, its contents finally at rest. When he returned to the park, the bench was empty, leaves scattered across the seat. He sat anyway, placing his hands loosely on either side of him. For a moment, he imagined the suitcase dissolving into the ground like a shadow at dusk. He didn't feel lighter exactly, more aligned, as if gravity had shifted gently. And as he looked up, he sensed life was about to test this new steadiness. The test came sooner than he expected, disguised as an ordinary conversation. A colleague asked him to take on another responsibility, smiling as if the answer were obvious. He felt the familiar tug to agree, that old reflex reaching for approval. For a second his chest tightened, and he almost nodded automatically. Then he imagined the empty space where the suitcase used to be and paused. "I can't this time," he said, voice steady but gentle, surprising even himself. The words hung in the air, neither sharp nor apologetic, simply true. The colleague blinked, recalibrating, then nodded with a shrug that said, life would go on. No disappointment thundered down, no hidden cost revealed itself. He walked away feeling both exposed and oddly peaceful. Later, when a family member teased him for being different lately, he didn't retreat. He smiled, not defensively, just acknowledging the observation. "Maybe I'm just catching up with myself," he replied, half joking, half sincere. The comment shifted the mood, softening what could have become criticism. For once, he didn't replay the exchange afterward looking for mistakes. His relationships began to adjust in subtle ways, like furniture rearranged overnight. Some people leaned closer, curious about the calm he now carried. Others kept their distance, unsure what to make of the change. He accepted both responses with a quiet understanding he hadn't known before. Authenticity, he realized, didn't demand agreement, only presence. That evening, he walked home under a sky slowly turning the color of ash and lavender. He noticed how his steps felt grounded, each one landing without hesitation. The world hadn't transformed, yet his place within it felt clearer. He placed a hand over his chest, a small ritual now, just to check in. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed another choice approaching, quieter but more personal. That quieter choice arrived the next morning, wrapped in the stillness before the day fully woke. He sat at the edge of his bed, unsure why he hadn't rushed to his phone yet. The room felt unusually spacious, as if time itself were waiting politely. Without planning to, he placed both feet on the floor and closed his eyes. It was the smallest pause, but it felt like opening a door he'd overlooked for years. He imagined the suitcase again, now resting at the foot of the bed like a harmless relic. Instead of avoiding it, he simply acknowledged its presence with a gentle nod. "What feels true today?" he whispered, the question barely louder than a breath. No grand answer appeared, only a soft sense of direction, like a compass finding north. It pointed toward something simple he'd been postponing for no good reason. He reached for a scrap of paper on the nightstand and wrote a single sentence. Not a plan, not a promise, just a quiet admission of what his heart wanted. The act felt almost shy, as though he were writing to an old friend he hoped would reply. He folded the paper once and set it beside the imagined suitcase. A tiny step, easily overlooked, yet it carried a surprising sense of relief. Throughout the day, whenever noise or doubt crept in, he touched his wrist lightly. It became a small signal to pause, breathe once, and remember that sentence. No one noticed the gesture, which made it feel even more personal and real. Each time he did it, the world seemed to slow just enough for him to stay present. He realized how little space authenticity actually needed to survive. That night, he returned to the park bench, the air cool and forgiving. He didn't expect to see the stranger, yet he felt accompanied all the same. The suitcase in his mind had grown quiet, almost transparent at the edges. He rested his hands on the bench, sensing a calm readiness he couldn't explain. And somewhere within that calm, a deeper understanding began to unfold. He began to understand that nothing new had been added to him at all. If anything, layers had quietly fallen away, like dust settling after a long journey. The person he'd been searching for wasn't ahead or behind. just waiting underneath. He smiled at the thought, a soft, private smile meant for no one else. Even the memory of the suitcase now felt less like a burden, more like a lesson. Walking through the park one last time, he noticed how the path curved gently homeward. He didn't rush, letting his steps match the unhurried rhythm of the evening. Somewhere along the way, he realized he no longer feared losing himself again. Once you know the way back, distance loses its power to intimidate. The air carried that quiet certainty, cool against his skin. Near the bench, he paused and imagined opening the suitcase once more. Inside, nothing demanded attention, only space, calm and untroubled. He closed it lightly and left it there in his mind. Not abandoned, just unnecessary now. For the first time, his hands felt completely free, as though they remembered their purpose. He slipped them into his pockets, content with their simple warmth. As the sky deepened into a soft, forgiving blue, he felt a gentle reunion within. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a steady sense of being whole again. He understood that peace hadn't come from changing his life, but from returning to it honestly. The journey inward had quietly reshaped everything outward, like roots nourishing unseen. He stood there a moment longer, letting the feeling settle without naming it. Then he turned toward home, carrying nothing, yet feeling accompanied. Lights flickered on in distant windows, each one holding a story of its own. He walked with the ease of someone no longer trying to outrun himself. Somewhere behind him, the park held the echo of all he'd released and reclaimed. And ahead, the path opened wide, welcoming him as if he'd never left.